Mr. Speaker, it is a disgusting state of the world in which the Saudi Arabian government is able to maintain its power through the oil wealth that is contributed by Western contractors coming in and making the siphoning and refinement of that oil easier. It is a disgusting state of the world when the Arab Spring is able to be continuously oppressed by consultants from companies like Blackwater that go in and train their militaries in order to prevent the will of the people from coming. What we're going to bring you from open government is a case that states that those individuals owe a moral duty to prevent the proper functioning of that repression and that lack of accountability. What I'm going to bring you are three things. First of all, why do you think that individuals, and particularly Western consultants, owe duties to other people, and particularly people in these nations? Secondly, why do you think they are committing active harms that are not only in terms of preventing regime change, but also in terms of active repression? And finally, why this will be effective in terms of destabilising and bringing down these regimes? First of all, let's be very clear. By Western, we mean consultants that come from any Western liberal democracy in which they have had the benefit of that democracy and that liberty. In terms of consultants, we mean like military consultants, we mean oil refinery consultants, we mean any other consultants we talk about. In terms of this level of sabotage that we want to make it materially more difficult for that dictatorship to continue in its proper function, but crucially, we want to caveat that we do not believe it should be in any way that leads to greater repression. So, for example, by hopefully mistraining troops such that they commit war crimes. Like, we think that's fairly clear on our side of the house. So, firstly, why do they owe duties? Two reasons. First of all, because they have materially benefited from a system in which they are continuing to deny to other people. By bolstering a system of dictatorship, they prevent the proper functioning of the will of the people from coming out. In that circumstance, it is something that they have benefited from and something that they deny to other people. But secondly, because they prevent accountability and lead to increased repression because of their ability to do so. So in turn, why is that? Why is it that they are committing harm? This functions in two ways. Firstly, directly, and secondly, indirectly. In terms of direct harm, it is very clear that the training by Eric Blackwater of troops in Saudi Arabia, places like Saudi Arabia, is leading to the prevention of the will of the people from coming out. That means that people are literally dying because of what that man chooses to do. It means that the will of the people is not coming forward. It means that oil wealth can continually be diverted to other individuals who are not accountable because there is no capacity for that to happen. This would not be as effective were it not for the contribution of that individual. In that circumstance, he owes a moral duty in order to prevent that, because he is materially contributing to that oppression and to that lack of accountability. I'll take over.
Jack, you're assuming that in the absence of those Blackwater consultants, nothing happens when those troops aren't effective. What replaces it instead is more oppressive training by troops that are going to lead to more deadly oppression in countries like Saudi Arabia.
We're going to suggest on our side of the house that the Saudi Arabian government chooses to use these people because they are the most effective way of getting them forward. Otherwise, it would be a somewhat irrational investment in order to further the cause of liberty at the same time as training troops to kill your citizens. That was weird. So secondly, in terms of indirect harm, how do they contribute? Firstly, in terms of the economic continuance of the regime, they enable that regime to continue. So under the regime of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, economists from the Chicago School were able to come in and train individuals in order to be able to produce economic benefits, which meant that there was no ability to hold that government to account because they did not have to seek the will of the people or seek accountability. They are able to continue their regime far, far better. No thanks. Equally, companies like Royal Dutch Shell in Nigeria, like US oil consultants in Saudi Arabia, are able to enable the regime to continue and oppression to continue in two ways. Firstly, because they are able to buy off elites who would otherwise demand accountability, elites like the military, elites like business leaders with vast oil wealth, which means that there is no demand amongst those key selectors to bring about change, even though there is popular will. It is not enough to simply have the will of the people in order to be able to change a dictatorship, Mr. Speaker. You also require the consent of elites like the army at the point at which they can be more easily paid off. It means that the will of the people gets denied. Secondly, they're able to continue the proper functioning of those countries through things like contribution to the world oil supply, which means that countries states essentially turn a blind eye to those abuses. That means that we don't get the kind of pressure that is necessary in order to bring about real substantive change. In another way, they are very directly contributing to that oppression and contributing to that harm. Yeah.
What do you imagine will happen when dictators in these countries notice that consultants are sabotaging?
I imagine that they will stop. Firstly, they may stop employing consultants. In that sense, it makes it far, far less easy for them to be able to continue their oppression, because it's like, otherwise they will move forward. Again, a benefit for our side of the house. Secondly, there is obviously going to be a time lag from when they notice that somebody is attempting to sabotage it. At that point, sabotage has already occurred, and the running of the regime is materially more difficult. You don't suggest a blanket policy of law that says everybody has to do it. This is a moral duty that individuals have in order to try and prevent the proper functioning of these regimes. Why is it going to be effective? Two ways. Firstly, because as I've said, they're less able to repress their people because they don't have the training to effectively be able to do it. Secondly, because they are less able to buy off people. But thirdly, because they make the kind of information available that is capable of bringing about regime change. They are able to reveal the information to the public that is currently concealed from them by making it public. So when people go to organisations like WikiLeaks to reveal what the Chinese government are doing, that makes it far, far harder for that government to conceal things. It makes it far harder for individuals to go unaware of what is going on. But what's more, it weights individuals who are currently puttering along in the status quo from moral carelessness, right? It means that they see the kinds of abuses that their governments are carrying out, when their governments haven't expressed that to them. In that circumstance, you're able to create the kind of pressure amongst those who are liberally minded to bring about change. Again, in a very real sense, the presence of that kind of information enables people to bring about change, both within the regime and without, because Western governments are now able to formulate accurate policy initiatives to cater to the exact workings of those governments. Mr. Speaker, this is something that contributes to harm. We want to prevent it. This is going to be effective in destabilising some of the worst regimes in the world. I am very proud to propose.
Dictatorships ahead of time if you deem it unsavory. We're fine with pulling out of agreement and facing fines if you're not okay with what the regime is doing. What we say, Mr. Speaker, however, where the government's going to fall short on their burden is why there's a positive duty to misrepresent or good faith efforts to serve the interests of their client midstream and actively damage their interests in the process, holding an economy and a population hostage just because you individually deem that you don't like that dictator. We don't think that's sufficient. Several points earlier. They talk about why the obligation derives from the fact that you benefit from the denial of rights. What we say first, Mr. Speaker, is if the government really believes that, do they believe that no foreign company should ever be able to allow in a regime that's considered a dictatorship? No one should ever be able to invest in these sorts of societies. They have to be able to defend that to be morally consistent. So presuming that they're going to say that that's not okay, that's immensely problematic. Because even if the state benefits, the population itself benefits from these sorts of projects as well. Extraction of oil, infrastructure, which Saudi Arabia does a lot of, that has nothing to do with building up its oil wealth. That employs people within the country itself. And when you create an obligation to cut off the proper functioning of these processes, that's going to harm people as a result. They talk about this idea that also, through economic advice, you're safeguarding the government. What we say is it's not that you're not holding them accountable, we say quite the opposite. You inculcate norms of proper governance and it can be a moderating force on the government. Because consultants often emphasize things like efficiency, like actually doing what you aspire to do, rather than wasteful patronage systems. We think that having this influence, which we get only on our side of the house, is going to be beneficial for the governance of the country. Then they talk about why preserving the state is bad, because they can buy off of elites. We think that there's still a place for sanctions from the international community to put pressure on this regime. That's a better model for change. But we also think that these norms of proper functioning make them less inclined for them to think that it makes sense to pay off elites and to govern properly. Then they make these arguments about why their success allows the U.S. to turn a blind eye. We don't think they've established a moral argument for why the economy of a country can be held hostage at the expense of the people simply because you believe it might yield benefits for regime change. You as an independent consultant are not fit to make that determination. They give you a list of reasons for why this is going to be effective. To whatever extent they can tell you that it might spur regime change, the problem is they have to sell you that the behavior of these dictators will be better absent outside forces. We don't think it means they're going to stop oppressing the people or pursue infrastructure projects. They're just going to do a shit job of it. They're going to rely on contractors, uneducated workforce, massive safety harms. Or in the case of the military, Michael's POI was, though we don't like what Blackwater does, why they may hire Blackwater is it's a more professional, properly trained, and disciplined military force. If you just have random, poorly equipped people running wild in the countryside, they can be far more dangerous than a trained Blackwater ever would be. Substantive matter. Why do we think there's not a positive moral professional obligation here? First, we say, when you sign a consulting or a law firm agreement, you don't promise to win the case. You don't promise to double profits. You don't assure that all your forecasts will be accurate, because you're not in control of that. But what is damn sure enshrined in all client service is the promise of good faith efforts to preserve the interests of that client. If you eliminate that notion that good faith exists, then you violated the privity of contract that you voluntarily entered to begin with. We think that this is problematic, first because even though they say it's only an individual decision, other dictators will take notice. So insofar as the privity of contract has been violated in some instances, that's when we think dictators might not hire consultants and that'll be bad, but they might do also bad things. What are these things? We think that there's not a positive moral obligation here, because in most instances, like whether you have a duty to save someone who's drowning, those are instances where we say inaction is bad, but it's bad only insofar as all you have to do is take reasonable steps that didn't violate some other law and didn't put you at great peril. So like if you couldn't swim, you wouldn't be expected to save someone who's drowning. The problem here is, one, you have a limited capacity to know how well your sabotage is going to impact that society. Secondly, you put yourself at massive risk if you sabotage the projects of a regime. I don't know if you heard that. Dictators aren't the most understanding people in the world. So they're not going to be like, oh, that's all right, man, we'll get it next time. They might kill you. They might kill your family. They can harm you in any number of ways. Why is that okay?
Well, then don't enter into a contract that makes the repression and killing of people easier.
So what we say is, in that world where they're not getting or not hiring any services with Western companies, we don't think that they're necessarily going to collapse. They're just going to do their already crappy form of governance in a more dangerous fashion. Next, I want to talk about why this is harmful for the population. We've already told you why oil extraction infrastructure is important. It enhances people's lives, there's spillover effects of wealth, it employs large swaths of the population. If your advice endangers these sorts of efforts and other people are harmed as a result, they didn't caveat that out in their model. We think it's morally reprehensible to say that a failure to consult adequately could give rise to more accidents in oil refining and harm people within that country itself. We also think that it's important to be able to seek Western consultation, because if you didn't do that, it's not that what these countries would be more beholden to is outside countries running their business within these borders, plundering them of their material mineral wealth, and taking all of that value outside of the country abroad. We think that these dictators, while they may not be perfect, are functionally defending their country from plundering multinational corporations who are not going to derive or not going to provide any value to the population at large. And finally, as we've already laid out, interacting with people that get you to think about efficiency makes dictators less isolated and more moderate in the long run because they have more exposure to the international community, more exposure to businesses. We don't like dictators, but misleading and then changing extreme interest violates your duty as a professional, and it's not fair to use these people as hostages. We're proud to oppose.
So the point I got annoyed with the leader of the opposition is when he said, look, if you've got an individual problem with dictators, don't contract with them. But that's your view, right? I don't think the subjugation of the people in Saudi Arabia is up for debate here as a legitimate lifestyle choice for running a government. At the point where you are making it easier for those people to oppress women, at the point you are making it easier for the people in Uganda to not give any of the money of their education budget and instead buy themselves nice swimming pools and expensive cars, you are making it easier to destroy the lives of people who have just been unlucky enough to be born in a country that he wasn't. That's why you have a moral duty, because you are complicit in acts of atrocity that are illegitimate. It is not a personal stance. What do I want to talk about today? Firstly, we're going to look at the moral duties that was talked about by Jack and completely ignored by opposition, and also introduce the idea of why this is the illegitimate state structure, and also why the capitalist activity here that he thinks, okay, I have the freedom to make profit, has been absolved here. But then I also want to look at the actual good that can be done. I'll firstly engage with his two eyes idea of, consultants do wonderful work there, even when they are, training people to shoot people. And then also look at the idea of information, of being the best source to sabotage the atrocities that these people commit. So first let's look at the moral stance here. So firstly, people are always born into a state, right, wherever you happen to be, and that state has amazing power over you. That's why we tend to think democracy is a good thing, because you can control the policies that are happening to you. People in these countries cannot do that. It's to the point where you get someone coming in, controlling those state structures, making it easier to not know what you are owed by the state, what money and resources it has to put in your behaviour. It makes it easier for those people to believe the lies they are told, like, say, Mugabe, when he stands and goes, all the problems that we face here in Zimbabwe are the fault of British colonialism 60 years ago. That is a lie, and would be easier to break down if they had the information that comes from the sources that these companies have but refuse to give over. Secondly then, let's look at moral duties. Now what we got from Jack were two instances, right? Firstly, the direct cases like Prince of Blackwater, where he trains people up to commit atrocities, and also secondly, with groups like Royal Dutch Shell, which train people into use material to work products. Here are 4 conditions in my moral framework that have nothing to do with acts of omissions. Firstly, do they have the knowledge that these acts are occurring? Yes, they do. Otherwise, they'd be very bad consultants because they're not working on the information. Do they have foreseeability? Yes, because they are planning very activities that happen. You know that the, say, cobalt in the region of Congo is not being used to power the people of that country, because you know where the funds go, because you have planned that structure in the first place. Thirdly, do they have the capability to give that information out? Yes, because they have privy to all levels and structures of control, because that's how they can plan the structure. And fourthly, do they have any competing duties? No. Well, I guess they could go and have some NGOs, but that would be a positive benefit, and I think that would be helpful. Secondly, then, on the capitalist structure, right, capitalism and freedom to make profit is not some absolute good. The reason we do it is there are resources in the world, people in the world, and you get better outcomes when you incentivize people to innovate and produce more. At the point where you are innovating and producing more highly trained soldiers to support suppress people, we think that's probably a poor idea, and the function to this capitalist incentive has been cut. I'll take okay.
Providing humanitarian aid lessens the pressure on changing regime change. Are you against foreign aid on your side of the house?
Well, I mean, I'm in favour of not making reductive generalised statements about aid and targeting it where useful and not using it where it can be, used by a regime in the same way as using natural resource abuse to suppress its own people. That's just not the case of humanitarian aid. Yes, it should be used effectively, not poorly. So, what did we hear on the efficacy of this from Open? Firstly, they said consultancies sometimes do some active good. Two reasons. Firstly, they do infrastructure, which has exogenous benefits, you get more money out. Doesn't really engage with the fact that Jack said that money is often used for patronage networks which lock down powers being uprised against them, and secondly, is often divided on ethnic lines, which fuels warfare within certain areas in Africa where they have natural resources that are used. Secondly, then, they also said, look, there's subtle influence. You can inculcate good governments into these poor regimes. Now, firstly, I don't think it's a normal interpretation of working with your clients when you inculcate them with things they don't really want you to. If McKinsey went into influence Kmart to be nicer to its workers, I think Kmart would be quite upset. At the point where he says, let's inculcate them, I think he's completely fine with us sabotaging what they actually want to achieve by bringing in government. So he can hold these ministers to account for the things that they owe them. That's probably just the eating off the joy crop, which, to be fair to him, I would do. Secondly, he said, well, if we pull out completely, it'll be worse for them. Well, firstly, that ignores all the things that Jack said, right? That, at the point they'll be less effective at doing this. That means they'll be less effective at suppressing their people and keeping resources that owes them away from them. Secondly, there's time lag, so there'll be a benefit while they're still there. Thirdly, that you can be more subtle than that. You could just use the intelligence. So intelligence services don't tend to give away the best state secrets. They use them in effective ways so they can still continue in the future. I think it'd be quite bad to just say, hey, we're sabotaging you should get rid of this tomorrow. There are more effective ways to do that. Fourthly, it's necessary for me that they wouldn't be cut off from having information because consultants aren't able to do the job without knowing who's in charge, what the resources are, where they get allocated to, so you have them in the first place. Second, then, note that even if he's right, that these people leave and the state becomes less good, that lots of their legitimacy in the nation comes from being effective. Pinochet in the 1970s could go to his group, the minority kept in control, and go, I am doing wonders for you and bringing you prosperity. At the point where they can't do that anymore, they are underminers of power and easier to attack. Why is information good, in a sense? In Uganda, 80% of the budget is siphoned off. All the Minister for Education did when she came in was give posters to school telling them what they were owed. That single act meant that instead of 80% being siphoned, 80% of the budget arrived in schools. That was because people themselves knew what they were entitled to and knew who was meant to give it to them. Consultants are in the best place possible to leak that information without even being found out. Why? Because as any first-year consultant, most of what they do is look at HR flow diagrams of who's in control and in control of what. All they have to do is leak that away and people can have themselves access. Why is that particularly important? Because what they do is stop the ability to build up factories that shut down opposition. These dictators breed on fear and power built on influence, and these companies make it easier to do this. You break them down by taking away patronage networks and empowering people with information of what they're owed. I couldn't be prouder to stand with their position.
That would lead automatically to the type of liberalization that we all, as Western liberal citizens, may want to see in these regimes. At the point where they just assert that these good benefits come from instability, I think they failed in their burden to show that your sabotage will necessarily lead to better moral outcomes. What I'm going to do in my speech and substantive today is talk a little bit about why we think that might not actually happen. But first, I want to do a little bit of rebuttal. Starting off with the issue of morality and the moral stance to take there. The first broad thing to say is lots of things help dictators stay in power. Dictators, people being happy, helps them stay in power. People are happy when they are fed, when they have health care, when they have roads and schools, and all other things that will help and won't defend all foreign aid. That seems to be the best and most lovely example of foreign aid people really accept. Now, the reason why this matters is they never give you a reason to distinguish between the aid you provide directly to the dictatorship itself or its government and the aid that you provide directly as, let's say, a nonprofit to the people. Both give support and legitimacy to the dictatorship because they make people happier. In fact, often when you are consulting for a dictatorship, what you are doing is advising a lower down part of the bureaucracy on how to build, let's say, an oil pipeline, a new factory, or some other form of economic development. There isn't a meaningful distinction here. But here's the other reason why I think they fail on the moral obligation argument. They ignored the two key caveats that Ferris gives you about when individuals don't have moral obligation. The first is when you can't assess with certainty what the effect of your action is going to be. All they give you, if you believe their four-part asserted framework for when you have a moral obligation, is that you can foresee what will happen in the dictatorship and that you have the capability to have an influence on it. First, you never know that your sabotage is actually going to be effective, right? You don't know that the information will get out. You don't know that it will be discovered. You don't know that it will have any sort of lasting effect. But much more importantly, even if you know it has an effect in the short term, you have no way of knowing whether it will have long-term positive effects. The really good analysis that built on my maybe poorly worded POI was the notion about contractors and Arab prince. Now, I don't like that the Saudi Arabian military is effective at repressing its people. I like, however, that it is probably trained to do so without needing to kill them. In other words, if you teach a military how to be professional, how to not have renegade soldiers who feel pressure to keep things in order, and then start shooting when things go to shit, you actually save more people's lives. In that sense, I would rather have an Arab prince-trained military than the opportunity cost of having a poorly trained military by some other oppressive regime in the Middle East that is going to teach them how to be more violent, more oppressive, and kill more people as a way of maintaining legitimacy, as opposed to appearing more professional as attaining legitimacy. I think they implicitly concede in their moral framework, and I'll take you in a second, chap, that you need to have positive moral outcomes, and with some degree of certainty. Ferris gives you the example of saving someone who's about to be drowning, right? The only way you can say you ever have a positive moral obligation to do that is if you know that you can swim and you know that you'll be successful at the point where they risk worse moral outcomes by having worse people involved in these regimes, leading to worse harms. That's potentially immoral. Yeah.
When black courts are engaged with the Saudi military, it's because they are explicitly trying to prevent regime change and prevent the Arab Spring.
Yep.
They know that if they're there, it is more effective to prevent
They're trying to prevent regime change. Guess what? The Saudi government, after the law of water, wants to prevent regime change. What will it do? Turn to another form of person who's going to teach their military, or come up with a crackhead to teach their military, how to be effective at stopping people from revolting. What do people who aren't Blackwater know how to do in order to stop people from revolting? Shooting them. That's why we see pressure in mass killing of demonstrators in Syria and other countries in the Middle East. Next, I want to talk about capitalism and the capitalist incentives that we have here. So they talk about, I already covered how anything remotely related to foreign aid that is helpful for people, it's going to lead to negative incentive and essentially prop up dictatorship under their side of the house. But when we talk about inculcating standards of good government, they say, oh, well, it's immoral on our framework for consultants to violate the will and undermine the will of the countries with whom they're working by, let's say, encouraging them to liberalize. We actually think the interests are quite well aligned here, right? A repressive Saudi Arabia and a free Saudi Arabia still has an interest in having oil pipelines. An oppressive Saudi Arabia and a free Saudi Arabia still has an interest in roads, schools, and other benefits to its people. At the point where consultants tell you how to do all of those things better, then when you eventually end up with freer states, however long it takes in the long run, they are better able to take care of their people on our side. Finally, they talk about this kind of indirect harm and issues with, supporting Pinochet in Chile, and also with this ridiculous example of posting in Uganda about the actual money that schools are owed. I think what this highlights is the significant risk that you're taking on here. They never really engage with Ferris's analysis about the risk that you expose yourself to. And this is the last and most important of the moral points, right? You don't have a moral obligation to put yourself, your family, your life at risk. Yes, you may be good at hiding from these governments, but guess what these governments are really good at doing? Finding out people who have betrayed them and enacting revenge against them, whether it's against you, you can't have a personal moral obligation to take on that risk. No, thank you. Now I want to talk to you about the alternative world on their side. Because even if you believe all of their analysis about how you're not going to have revenge enacted against you, you are going to have some sort of successful attempt at making a change by sabotaging these governments, I don't think they've ever shown that there's significant benefits that come from it. First, there's a chance that sabotage is just discovered early and dealt with, right? You tear down the posters in the Ugandan schools, it affects one fiscal year of funding, the government gets even more cautious, steals more money from schools next year, goes back to the same old thing, except now you have a government that is more skeptical, more repressive, and less willing to take risks with helping people if it sees that helping its people with consultants is less going to be legitimately wrong. But let's assume that you actually get some sort of meaningful change. We think that if there's one thing to learn from the Arab Spring, it's that change needs to be organic. And first, if these governments can point to the fact that someone has been sabotaging them as the source of change, they can legitimize any subsequent democratic movement. Look at the fact that in Iran they still believe the UK is responsible for everything that happens there secretly. Skepticism and fear of outside influence is pervasive in these repressive countries, and it can last for years. You weaken the ability of any democratic movement to get started, to make a meaningful long-term change by associating that democratic movement with renegade Western consultants that have said they're in a better position than the populace themselves to know how to bring about change and how to ultimately undermine this government. It's bad economics, it's bad on an individual level, and ultimately it's worse off for these societies. We beg to oppose.